A tortoise and a hare make a wager. A crow loses a piece of cheese from its beak because a fox flatters it into singing. A shepherd boy cries wolf so many times that when a real wolf finally comes, nobody believes him anymore. We all know these stories. Most of us heard them as children. But have you ever stopped to ask who actually told them to us first? We have a name for the source: Aesop. And here is the strange part. Historians are not actually certain this man ever existed, and if he did, who he really was. And yet his name has sat above these stories for roughly 2,500 years. So how does a ghost become the father of the world's most famous tradition of fables? Let's get into it.
Let us start honestly. Solid information about Aesop is scarce. Ancient sources place him in the 6th century before the Common Era. The historian Herodotus, writing generations later, mentions that Aesop was a slave on the island of Samos, owned by a man named Iadmon, and that he was eventually killed by the people of Delphi. But even Herodotus reports this less as verified fact than as a story already circulating in his own time. In the centuries that followed, an enormous body of legend accumulated around Aesop's life. Some accounts describe him as physically deformed and stammering, a slave who won his freedom through sheer wit. Other scholars argue that most of these details were folk invention, layered on much later. Today, the prevailing scholarly view is this: Aesop may never have existed at all, or he may have been a real storyteller, but over time his name became a kind of umbrella label, attached to hundreds of animal fables gathered from many different sources and centuries. In other words, the book in your hands is not the work of a single author. It is a compilation, a legacy passed down through the Greek oral tradition across generations.
Despite this uncertainty, antiquity also produced a popular biographical tradition about Aesop's supposed life, known today as the Aesop romance. In these texts, Aesop appears as an ugly, stammering slave of extraordinary wit who outsmarts his masters with words, eventually wins his freedom, and ends up advising kings. Most historians agree that this biography is largely fiction, born less from a genuine life story than from a public desire to invent a hero worthy of the tales. So we are left with a double layer of uncertainty. Both who the fables truly belong to and how much of the life story attached to that name is even real remain open questions. Rather than presenting the uncertain as certain, we prefer to be upfront about it. These fables went unwritten for a long time, passed by word of mouth from person to person. The first known attempt at a written collection is credited to the Athenian statesman and philosopher Demetrius of Phalerum in the 3rd century before the Common Era, though that original collection has not survived, and we only know of its existence secondhand. Later, during the Roman period, a freed slave named Phaedrus set the fables into Latin verse. On the Greek side, the poet Babrius did similar work in Greek verse. As the subtitle of this very book indicates, the English text we read today is translated directly from that old Greek tradition. Across the centuries, material was added, altered, and carried into different languages. In the 15th century, the English printer William Caxton translated and printed the fables in English, a turning point in their spread through the English-speaking world. So, what is actually inside these fables? The structure is almost always the same: a brief scene, talking animals, and a small lesson at the end. In The Tortoise and the Hare, the fast but arrogant hare naps mid-race, and the slow but persistent tortoise overtakes him. The lesson is clear: steadiness is a more reliable ally than raw talent. In The Fox and the Crow, a crow flattered into showing off its singing voice opens its beak and drops the cheese it was holding, which the fox promptly steals. The lesson is that falling for flattery costs you something real. In The Boy Who Cried Wolf, a child who lies too often about danger finds that no one believes him when real danger finally arrives. The lesson is that trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild. In The Ant and the Grasshopper, An ant that spends the summer working and preparing is compared to a grasshopper that spends it singing, and when winter comes, the grasshopper goes hungry. In The Goose That Laid the Golden Eggs, a greedy farmer kills the goose that lays one golden egg a day, hoping to seize all its gold at once, only to find nothing inside, losing both the goose and his future. The lesson is that greed destroys patience. In The Lion and the Mouse, a great lion spares a small mouse that has stumbled into his path, and later, caught in a hunter's net, that same mouse returns and gnaws through the ropes to free him. The lesson is that even the smallest kindness can eventually be repaid many times over. And in The North Wind and the Sun, the two argue over which of them can make a traveler remove his coat. The harder the wind blows, the tighter the traveler clutches his coat. But when the sun simply warms him gently, he takes it off on his own. The lesson is that persuasion by warmth outlasts persuasion by force. What unites all these fables is that the moral is stated directly. The characters are never complicated. The fox is cunning, the lion is powerful, the donkey is stubborn, and that simplicity lets the listener grasp the lesson instantly. Using animals instead of people also allowed storytellers to smuggle in criticism that might otherwise have been dangerous to voice. A slave or an ordinary citizen could say through a story about a wolf and a lamb what they could never say directly. This is also why, in the ancient world, these fables were used not only for children, but for adults training in rhetoric. Teachers of oratory had students memorize Aesop's fables as compact, effective examples, then ask them to retell the stories in their own words. Over time, these fables became a standard tool for teaching reading and writing in Greek and Roman schools, much as they later became one in the English-speaking world after Caxton's printed edition.
The reason these fables are still read today, still told to children in nearly every language on Earth, is perhaps exactly this simplicity. These short stories, produced by a man said to have been a slave 2,500 years ago, or by the tradition that carries his name, convey moral truths a child can grasp instantly, without requiring any complex philosophical system. Patience, honesty, the cost of greed, the value of real friendship, all taught without a single sermon, just through a story. That is why these fables remain reference points not only in children's literature, but in politics, literature, and everyday speech. A phrase like crying wolf is still used today to describe someone who raises false alarms. The cultural footprint of this tradition is remarkable. Stories like The Tortoise and the Hare and The Ant and the Grasshopper have been reimagined by countless painters, sculptors, and writers across the centuries. In the 17th century, the French poet La Fontaine adapted these fables into his own language, turning them into a poetic masterpiece. In the 20th century, the Walt Disney Studios brought many of them to the screen as animated shorts. Even today, the English phrase sour grapes, describing someone who belittles what they cannot have, comes directly from The Fox and the Grapes. And there is one more curious detail. Plato records that Socrates, in his final days in prison awaiting execution, spent some of that time putting Aesop's fables into verse. One of antiquity's greatest philosophers, facing his own death, found meaning in these plain animal stories. Whatever the truth about Aesop himself, there is no doubt about the power of the tales told in his name.
We have covered Aesop's fables, but each of these short stories is really a world of its own. If you would like to listen to the complete book as an audiobook, you will find a link in the description. Subscribe for more books in this series. Until the next one, remember the lesson of one of these fables. Slow and steady wins the race.